You wouldn't expect a woman with a clipboard and a frown sharp enough to slice through steel to trigger a town-wide uproar. But when Karen strutted down the pier one hot summer morning, sunglasses perched like a crown of entitlement, she had no idea what she was about to awaken. To her it was just another boat, another complaint to file, another eyesore to clear from her picturesque neighborhood. But to the old man sitting quietly on the dock nearby, it was a piece of history, a legacy. A floating graveyard of memories sealed in battleship gray. What Karen saw as an abandoned vessel, he saw as a sacred promise, one that he vowed never to let be broken no matter who tried, and it all started with a single call to the towing company. The harbor had always been peaceful, the kind of place where time felt like it held its breath. Locals knew not to disturb the boat moored at the far end, the one with rusted edges, faded navy markings, and a tiny American flag that never stopped fluttering. No one touched it, no one dared, because everyone in the town knew who it belonged to, or more importantly, who it honored. But Karen wasn't from here. She had just moved into her waterfront condo 3 weeks earlier, and in that time had already filed complaints about a teenager's motorcycle, a father's dog barking too loud, and a group of retired veterans playing dominoes too close to her patio. She didn't ask questions, she acted. And so she acted again. "This thing is a hazard," she told the harbor patrol when they wouldn't respond to her HOA threats. "It's an environmental violation, it's unsightly, if you won't remove it, I will." No one expected her to go that far, but Karen wasn't bluffing. The old man's name was Henry. To most he was just that Henry, quiet, slow-moving, gray-haired with a faded navy tattoo on his forearm and an expression that rarely changed. But inside he was a storm of memory. Every bolt on that boat reminded him of someone, a friend, a comrade, a brother. The ship, though small, had served during the Vietnam War as a river patrol vessel. He had purchased it at an auction decades ago, restored it with his own hands, and turned it into a floating memorial for the fallen. He visited it every morning, sat on the dock with his coffee, talked to the names engraved on a brass plate near the cabin door. He wasn't just guarding a boat, he was guarding ghosts. Karen didn't care. 2 days after her last complaint, a flatbed tow truck rumbled into the harbor parking lot. Henry watched from his usual spot. At first he didn't believe it. Surely this wasn't real, surely no one would touch the vessel. But then he saw the driver stepping out, clipboard in hand, and behind him, Karen, smiling like she'd just won a prize at a fair. "She's an eyesore," she said, folding her arms, "and she's leaving today." The driver hesitated. "Ma'am, I was told this was abandoned, but—" "It is," Karen cut in. "No registration, no signage, it's trespassing." Henry stood slowly, but something about the way he rose made the tow driver pause. It wasn't speed or strength, it was the silence, like a storm was brewing in a whisper. "This boat," Henry said, voice low but steady, "is not abandoned." Karen laughed. "And who are you?" "The dock janitor." Henry stepped forward, reached into his back pocket, and pulled out a laminated card. It wasn't his ID, it was a certificate, issued by the Department of Veterans Affairs. At the bottom it bore the words, "Official Navy Memorial Designation." Above it, a nameplate, USS Liberty Bell. "Do you know how many names are welded into the walls of this vessel?" he asked, his voice now trembling but not with fear. 83, every one of them dead. Most were my friends, some were my brothers. This boat is their grave." Karen rolled her eyes. "That's ridiculous. You can't just call it a memorial and leave it rotting on public property." "It's not public property," Henry said, handing the driver another piece of paper. "This one was a deed, donated years ago by the town council. The dock space was his, and the boat protected by federal recognition." For a moment the only sound was the wind. Then Karen snapped, "This is insane. He's lying. That paperwork could be fake." But the tow driver had seen enough. He stepped back, radioed in, and canceled the tow. Karen's face turned crimson. "You'll regret this," she hissed. But Henry didn't answer. He walked past her, stepped onto the deck of the boat, and placed a hand on the railing. The war was over, but a new battle was just beginning. She thought it was over, thought the paperwork had been fake, thought maybe if she pushed hard enough, made enough noise, twisted the right arms, she'd get her way. After all, she always had before. Karen wasn't used to losing, but what she didn't understand was that this wasn't about her winning, it was about someone else not being forgot. The town wasn't just siding with Henry, it was standing up for something sacred, and Karen. She was about to find out how deep those roots went, and just how far they would stretch to protect one old man and the vessel he swore to never leave behind. The next morning the harbor was quiet again, but the tension in the air was thick. Word had spread fast, faster than Karen expected. The local diner buzzed with whispers. Neighbors who had never said more than 2 words to each other suddenly sat at the same booths trading stories about the boat. Some remembered the day Henry brought it home, covered in rust and mud as if it had crawled back from a battlefield. Others recalled the small ceremony he held when he first moored it, standing in silence as he read out the names of the men he served with, placing a small wreath on the deck and saluting as the wind caught the flag. These were not just memories, they were testimonies. Karen hadn't just tried to move a boat, she had tried to erase a monument. But she wasn't giving up. That afternoon, she marched into the mayor's office without an appointment. Her heels clicked on the marble floor like gunshots. The receptionist tried to stop her, but Karen brushed past, fury in her stride. "This is a legal violation," she snapped, slamming her file onto the mayor's desk. "That boat is an unsanitary, unregistered structure and it's lowering property values. I have half the HOA board behind me." Mayor Daniels, a soft-spoken man in his 60s with a tired smile and an old war medal in a shadow box behind him, said nothing at first. He opened the file, flipped through the printouts, photos of the boat, close-ups of flacking paint, a highlighted copy of the HOA bylaws. When he finally looked up, his voice was calm, measured. "Do you know what that vessel is, Karen?" She folded her arms. "A health hazard." He shook his head. "It's a piece of naval history and it's protected." Karen's tone sharpened. "You're saying you'd rather defend that rust bucket than the taxpayers who want it gone?" Mayor Daniels leaned back in his chair. "That rust bucket saved lives, that vessel saw combat, it was manned by people who never came home, and the man who owns it has more right to that dock than any HOA document you can wave in my face." She opened her mouth to argue, but the mayor raised a hand. "My brother died in Vietnam," he said softly. "I would have given anything for someone to build a boat in his memory." Karen didn't reply. For a moment, her jaw worked in silence like she was chewing words she couldn't spit out. "This town," he added, "was built by men like Henry, men who came back with scars you'll never see. That boat is more than a memorial, it's a promise, and we don't break promises here." Karen stormed out, but this time something in her step had changed. She no longer looked like a woman who had the upper hand, she looked like someone who had just realized she was standing in the wrong fight. But realization didn't mean surrender. That night she took to Facebook. Her post was long, angry, twisted facts into fiction, claimed the boat was a safety hazard, claimed Henry was aggressive and unstable, said he was hoarding chemicals on board, said the flag was a political symbol and that children were being exposed to toxic militarism. It went viral. Within hours the comments exploded, but not in the way she expected. Instead of support she got rage. Hundreds of users, some from the town, others from military communities across the country, descended on her post like a wave. Veterans shared their own stories. Families posted photos of loved ones lost in service. Former Navy men tagged the Department of Veterans Affairs demanding protection. Someone even found footage of Henry's boat dedication ceremony and reposted it with the caption, "He didn't just build a boat, he built a grave for his friends." Karen deleted the post. But it was too late. By morning, news vans lined the street outside her building. Reporters asked questions she wasn't ready for. "Why did you try to tow a Navy memorial? Did you know it honored the dead? What do you say to the veterans calling you un-American?" She shut her blinds, pulled her curtains tight. But truth had already burst through her carefully crafted walls, and Henry stood quietly by his vessel, untouched by the chaos, sipping coffee and staring out at the bay. Because the fight wasn't about winning headlines. It was about never forgetting who they were and what they gave up. They thought she'd back down, that after being roasted online, humiliated by the mayor and exposed to the country, she'd quietly disappear. But Karen wasn't wired for humility. Her pride was like concrete, hard, cold, and impossible to break unless it cracked from within. And while the town stood united, she was already plotting a new move, something bigger, something louder. This time it wasn't just about removing a boat, it was about proving she could. And when someone driven by ego takes on something sacred, the fallout is never just personal, it's explosive. 3 days passed. The town had settled into a fragile calm, like everyone was waiting to see what came next. Henry didn't say much. He continued his daily visits to the boat, polishing a nameplate here, replacing a worn rope there. The local kids waved when they passed, and the fishermen gave him respectful nods. The boat had never looked more cared for. But then at 2:00 a.m. on a Thursday, the silence shattered. A loud metallic crash echoed across the harbor. Lights flickered on in surrounding houses. Dogs barked. Someone shouted. And when people rushed to their windows or grabbed their flashlights and stepped outside, they saw it, Karen, dressed in black activewear, standing at the edge of the dock, a bolt cutter in one hand and a coil of rope in the other. She had tried to untie the vessel. She had tried to tow it herself. And she had failed spectacularly. Because what she didn't know was that Henry had reinforced the moorings weeks ago. Heavy-duty steel chains, triple-knotted, bolted deep into the dock's foundation. Not something that could be undone with Home Depot tools and determination. The clang everyone had heard. That was her tripping over the anchor chain. She hit the deck literally, slipped, fell into a pile of coiled rope and tangled herself like a fly in a web. By the time the first neighbor reached her, she was cursing at the water, furious and soaked. Police were called. She tried to explain, claimed she had every right, said she was conducting a citizen towing operation on behalf of the HOA. The officer raised an eyebrow at 2 in the morning. She stammered something about safety codes and noise ordinances. But it didn't matter. What did matter was the video. Because someone had filmed the whole thing, Karen sneaking around the dock, fumbling with chains and eventually falling flat. Within hours it was online. Again, this time under the title, Entitled Woman Tries to Tow Navy Memorial Fails Hilariously. It trended nationally. Veterans posted reaction videos, news anchors chuckled through recaps, even late-night comedians picked it up. But no one was laughing at Henry. Because when reporters returned to him for comment, he simply said, "It's not about me, it's about them," and pointed to the engraved names on the boat's brass plate. Then he added, "I made a promise I'd never let them be forgotten, and I intend to keep it." Karen, on the other hand, was issued a citation for trespassing and attempted property damage. She tried to sue for emotional distress, claimed the internet had turned her into a villain, that she was the real victim. No lawyer would take the case. But she still wasn't finished. A week later, she filed an anonymous complaint with the state's environmental board. She alleged the boat was leaking oil into the water, that it was endangering marine life, that it violated coastal preservation regulations. The board was required to investigate. Inspectors arrived, they conducted tests, took samples, checked the hull, looked at the fuel tanks. Henry watched, quiet and calm, hands behind his back. When they finished, they handed him a piece of paper. It was a certification. Clean. No leaks, no violations, no cause for concern. Karen had once again tried to fire a cannon, and all she got was the echo. But while the town was celebrating, Henry knew something deeper was happening, something more dangerous than citations or bolt cutters. Karen wasn't just angry, she was obsessed. And obsessed people didn't quit, they escalated. So Henry did something he hadn't done in years. He opened the sealed box stored beneath the pilot's chair on the vessel. Inside was a thick leather folder, one he'd never planned to touch again. It contained a collection of letters, articles, and photographs, some of his fallen crew, others of memorial events across the country, and at the very bottom, a contact card. It belonged to Commander Walter Jameson, retired U.S. Navy, founder of the National Naval Memorial Trust. Henry picked up the phone. Because if Karen wanted a war, he wasn't going to fight it alone. If Karen thought she was dealing with just a lonely old man in a rusty boat, she was about to find out just how wide and deep the waters of loyalty truly ran. Because what she didn't see, what she could never understand, was that when you attack a memory tied to sacrifice, you don't just offend one person. You summon a whole generation. And sometimes that generation shows up in uniform, even after their service ends. When Henry called Commander Walter Jameson, the conversation was short, just a few sentences exchanged in gravelly tones. Henry explained the situation. Jameson listened. There was a pause. Then Jameson said, "Give me the date, I'll bring the fleet." It sounded dramatic, too dramatic, but Henry knew what that meant. The town had seen ceremonies before: Memorial Day gatherings, veteran reunions, quiet flag raisings on foggy mornings, but nothing prepared them for what rolled into the harbor the following Saturday. It started with 3 RVs that arrived at dawn. Then came the motorcycles, 24 of them rumbling like thunder, flags whipping in the morning breeze. Each bike bore a small plaque, POWMA USS Houston, Desert Storm, Vietnam, Some riders had gray beards, others walked with canes, but every one of them stood tall when they stepped off. Then the cars came, navy blue sedans, a restored WWII Jeep, even a decommissioned Humvee with wreaths tied to the front grille. By noon, over 150 veterans had arrived. And at the center of it all was Henry's boat. They lined the docks, polished the deck, repainted the faded lettering on the hull, hung new flags, one for the Navy, one for the Marines, one for the fallen. They didn't shout, they didn't chant, they stood in silence. One by one they stepped aboard, saluted, and whispered names of the dead, some of which hadn't been spoken in decades. The town watched, breathless. Even the mayor wiped away a tear as Commander Jameson led a moment of silence, then turned to the crowd and said, "We protect each other even when the world forgets." Karen watched too. From her balcony. At first she looked smug, arms crossed, lips pursed. But as the ceremony unfolded, as the stories poured out, stories of brothers lost at sea, of 19-year-olds who never made it home, of survivors who still dreamed of gunfire and smoke, her expression started to change. It wasn't guilt. Not yet. It was confusion. Like she was beginning to realize that what she'd tried to destroy was far bigger than property value or noise complaints. It was identity, honor, brotherhood. But Karen being Karen, she didn't retreat. Instead, she called the harbor authority again, this time claiming the gathering was unauthorized, that it was causing traffic and safety concerns, that she feared it might be a militia event. The dispatcher hung up. She tried again, this time to the local news, claimed she had a scoop, said a mob of angry veterans had descended on her neighborhood. The anchor listened, then asked a single question. "Do you mean the Navy Memorial Celebration?" Karen went quiet. She had lost the narrative. That night, Henry sat on the deck of the boat with Commander Jameson and 3 others. They shared old stories over black coffee, their voices soft and thoughtful. Some of the younger veterans took watch at the dock's edge, just in case. Across the street, Karen's lights stayed off. No more Facebook posts. No more clipboard threats. But Henry knew it wasn't over. Because people like her didn't stop out of understanding. They stopped when the wind turned too strong to fight and waited for the storm to pass. He wasn't angry anymore. He was prepared. The next morning, as the veterans packed up and headed out, leaving behind a freshly polished memorial, a new brass plaque, and a dock lined with flowers, Henry found something taped to the boat. It was a note. Typed anonymous. "I'll get it removed if it's the last thing I do. You're not a hero, you're a squatter." Henry folded the paper, slipped it into his pocket. And for the first time in years, he locked the cabin. Because when the battle leaves the headlines and enters the shadows, it's not just noise anymore. It's personal. Some wars are fought on open seas, some in trenches shoulder to shoulder, but the quietest battles, the ones people never talk about, happen in paperwork, whispers, and shadows. And Henry, though a man shaped by fire and steel, was now staring down a threat made of ink and bureaucracy. Karen had failed publicly, but she was regrouping privately. And this time her attacks wouldn't come with bolt cutters or late-night trespassing. They'd come with signatures, stamped envelopes, and smiling officials who didn't realize they were being used as weapons. The note on the boat had rattled Henry, but not because he was afraid. He'd seen worse, much worse. What bothered him was the cowardice of it. No face, no name, just cold words left in the dark. It reminded him of the war in ways he didn't like, enemies you couldn't see, traps you couldn't anticipate. And sure enough, a trap was already being set. It began with a letter from the Regional Code Enforcement Office. According to the document, an anonymous concern had been submitted regarding zoning compliance and structural stability of an aging watercraft moored on private dock space. The language was polite, almost friendly, but Henry recognized the bite beneath it. He'd seen enough orders in his life to know when one was setting you up. He had 10 days to respond. Then came another letter, this one from the State Heritage Department. It questioned the validity of the vessel's designation as a memorial. Apparently, someone had flagged it for misrepresentation of historical purpose. Karen was moving again. But now she was hiding behind desks and forms. Henry didn't panic, he prepared. He gathered every certificate, every photograph, every newspaper clipping ever written about the boat. He contacted the Department of Veterans Affairs and requested confirmation of the original federal recognition. and he called Commander Jameson again, not for reinforcements but for clarity. "She's not done," Henry said. "No," Jameson agreed, "but neither are we." The town stepped up too. A group of high school students offered to document the boat as a preservation project. Local teachers brought their classes for field trips. A local artist volunteered to repaint the hull with a mural of the original crew. Even the mayor wrote a formal letter to the state confirming the town's position. But bureaucracy moves slow, and Karen moved faster. Within the week, an inspector showed up at Henry's dock. She was polite, professional, clearly just doing her job, but Henry could see in her eyes the weight of paperwork. She didn't want to be the villain, she was just holding the clipboard for someone else. As she took measurements and photos, Henry asked, "Do you know what this boat is?" She paused. "I read the file." "No," he said gently, "I mean, do you really know?" He told her about his first mission, about the night 2 of his crew were swept overboard in a firefight along the Mekong River, how he pulled one back, how the other was lost forever, how when he came home no one talked about it, no one asked, so he built the boat as a way to speak without speaking, to honor the men who never got their parades. By the time he finished, the inspector wasn't writing anymore. She just stood there quiet. Then she said, "I'll file the report, but off the record, thank you." The report she sent up the chain was fair, honest, and ultimately in Henry's favor. But Karen wasn't done. 3 days later, another anonymous complaint appeared, this one targeting Henry's right to live on the property. It questioned the ownership of his dock lease, claimed it was unclear, and accused him of unauthorized occupancy. That was when the mayor stepped in. He called a town council meeting, invited residents, brought copies of all the documents, and he asked one question. "Does anyone here want this man removed?" Not a single hand went up. Instead, an elderly woman named Mrs. Talbot stood and said, "My husband's name is on that boat. If you take it, you might as well erase him too." Then came Mr. Diaz, whose brother had served with Henry, then Linda, the school principal, then a kid barely old enough to vote who said, "I didn't know what the Navy really meant until I met him." The council voted unanimously to reaffirm the memorial's protected status. They even approved a new plaque to be installed, one that officially listed the names of the 83 crew Henry had honored. But that night, someone spray-painted a message on the dock's edge. "Fraud." Henry cleaned it himself, quietly, no cameras, no posts, just a brush and a bucket. Because some fights aren't won with shouting, they're won with persistence. Some people wear down over time. They bend with the pressure, soften under the weight, given when the world won't stop pushing. But Henry wasn't made like that. He'd lived through monsoon storms and mortar fire. He stood in the silence of funerals where no one clapped and no one cheered. What Karen didn't understand, and what she never would, was that Henry didn't fight to win. He fought because some things were worth standing for, even if no one else stood with you. But he wasn't standing alone anymore. And what was once one old man against a furious neighbor had become something bigger, something stronger, something permanent. In the weeks that followed the town council's vote, something strange started happening. People who had never spoken to Henry before started stopping by. Some brought flowers, others brought coffee. One young man, barely 20, sat with him on the dock for 2 hours asking questions about the war, not because he had to for school, but because his grandfather had died in combat and no one ever told him what it was like. Henry answered every question. The boat, once rusted and quiet, now buzzed with activity. Volunteers helped repaint the deck. A retired welder offered to fix the bent railing. Someone donated solar-powered lights so it could be illuminated at night. And local veterans began holding monthly gatherings there, reading names aloud by candlelight. It was no longer just Henry's mission. It was a movement. But Karen, even with the tide turning against her, wasn't finished. She couldn't be. For her, this wasn't just about a boat anymore. It was about control. About being told no in a town where she thought she could control every inch, so she shifted strategies one final time. She called in a state senator. Someone she once donated to, someone she believed owed her a favor. And sure enough, the senator's office issued a formal request for review. Was the town in violation of coastal development statutes by allowing an unauthorized structure to remain permanently docked? It was the most dangerous move yet. Because this wasn't just about Henry now, it threatened the council, the harbor, the town itself. The mayor held another emergency meeting. This time there was fear in the room. Legal fear. Liability fear. Henry sat in the back, silent, watching. Then, before anyone could speak, Commander Jameson walked in, followed by a woman in a crisp Navy uniform and a man in a Department of Defense jacket. They handed the mayor a binder. Inside, full documentation of the boat's protected status, photos from its wartime service, and a signed letter from the Naval Historical Center affirming its place as a registered memorial under federal guidelines. Any attempt to remove or tamper with this vessel, the letter read, may be interpreted as obstruction of a federally recognized memorial and could result in legal action. The room was silent. And then the mayor, with a slow breath, looked up and said, "Well, that settles that." There were no more complaints after that. Karen, who didn't attend the meeting, received her own letter days later from the Department of Defense legal office. It advised her in professional, almost condescending language to cease any further interference and warned that additional action could result in civil penalties. Her reign of complaints had ended not with applause but with silence. But Henry, he didn't celebrate. He simply went back to the boat, cleaned the deck, adjusted the flag, lit a candle for one of the names on the plaque that night and sat with it as it flickered. And as the wind rolled in across the water, he whispered, "You're safe now, boys, no one's taking you anywhere." The boat would never sail again, it didn't need to. It was anchored in something far deeper than water. It was anchored in memory. You'd think that after all the drama, after the news vans disappeared and the legal letters were tucked away, the story would simply fade out. But some stories don't end with a final scene. They echo, they linger, because when something becomes part of the soul of a town, part of the rhythm of its tides and the hush of its nights, it never truly stops. And for Henry, for the town, for the names etched into that boat's worn frame, the real ending was something quieter, deeper, and far more powerful than any courtroom win or online applause. Months passed. The seasons began to change. Summer gave way to brisk autumn winds, and the leaves along the harbor turned shades of copper and blood orange. The boat, now freshly restored, had become more than a landmark. It had become a place of pilgrimage. Veterans from out of town came to visit. A local school added it to their history curriculum. Even tourists who stumbled upon the harbor by accident were drawn to it, standing silently at its edge as if it called them. Karen, meanwhile, had grown quiet. She no longer stormed down the dock or shouted about bylaws. Her name was rarely mentioned anymore, except as a cautionary whisper about what happens when someone tries to erase a legacy without understanding it. Some said she sold her condo and left. Others claimed she still lived there but rarely came outside, but no one really knew for sure, and Henry never asked. Because he had no more time for bitterness. He had work to do. Every morning he still made the same walk, cup of coffee in one hand, folded newspaper in the other. Sometimes he'd sit for hours, sometimes just minutes. Some days he'd speak to the names on the plaque. Other days he'd just sit in silence and watch the water shimmer. One morning, he found something taped to the side of the boat again. But this time it wasn't hate. It was a thank you card. Inside was a photo of a young soldier, a Marine, standing next to the boat, smiling. The note read, "My brother served with one of the men on this memorial. I didn't know he was remembered anywhere. Thank you for making sure he still is." Henry closed the card and held it in his hand for a long time. He didn't cry, he didn't need to. Because for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was remembering the fallen alone. One evening, the town held a candlelight vigil at the dock. Not a ceremony, not a holiday, just a gathering. Word had spread quietly, and by sunset, the entire shoreline was dotted with glowing lights held in the hands of men, women, children, all standing in complete silence. Henry stood at the front, the mayor beside him, Commander Jameson a few steps back. And as the candles flickered in the wind, Henry did something he hadn't done in years. He read each of the 83 names out loud. His voice cracked halfway through, not from weakness but from the weight of memory, but he finished them all, every name. And when he reached the end, the crowd didn't clap, they didn't cheer. They simply whispered, almost in unison, "Thank you." Because that's what the boat had become. Not just a memorial. Not just a vessel. But a thank you cast in steel and salt. Later that night, as the candles were blown out and the dock returned to darkness, Henry stayed behind. He sat on the deck alone, looking out at the quiet horizon. He didn't feel old, he didn't feel tired. He felt proud. Because he had fought for something bigger than himself. And he had won. Not by pushing back, but by standing still. And when the wind picked up, tugging at the flag atop the mast, Henry smiled and whispered the same thing he did every night before heading home. "You're still here, and as long as I am, so will you."